Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Peter Heslam, and today we're going to be talking about Peter's paper on the relationship between religion and human development. And this paper is titled Fate, Fortune, and the Future, Christianity and Enterprise in Human Development. Hello, Peter. How are you doing?
Oh, hi, Lipton. I'm doing fine. Thank you very much. It's great to be on the show.
All right, it's great to finally have you. So, Peter, what is the evangelical Pentecostal charismatic movement?
Well, this is a movement that is often simply called Pentecostalism, but I call it the evangelical charismatic Pentecostal movement because that reflects its breadth and diversity a lot more than just picking out the Pentecostal bit of it. I belong to the Anglican Communion, and in the Anglican Communion are many people with Pentecostal beliefs. They believe in speaking in tongues, they believe in miraculous healing, they believe that God answers prayer. They believe in many of the things that people who with a big P Pentecostal also believe, but they don't call themselves Pentecostal. They may call themselves charismatic or renewed Anglicans or a whole host of other things. So by calling it the evangelical charismatic Pentecostal movement, I'm kind of be a bit more broad church about it. And I think this does influence studies of Pentecostalism negatively, that they tend to look at only at those churches that call themselves Pentecostal and leave out actually a huge amount of Pentecostal spirituality that exists in other churches.
All right, then. And the focus of your paper is the link between Christianity and human development. But before we begin to talk about this link, we're going to discuss the role of the prosperity gospel in attracting people to Pentecostalism. What is the prosperity gospel?
Well, it can, I suppose, be boiled down to the idea that God wants you to flourish in material terms, and what it requires of you to enter into that fullness of material blessing is faith. So if you would just believe, God will pour out his material blessings upon you. And if that's not happening, you need to believe more, and you need to trust more, and you need to wait, and it will come. And you often need to give more as well. And that, I think, flags up a concern that often in circles of the prosperity gospel, there is a lot of giving, and pastors within those circles can become very wealthy, and they can then give a narrative about the prosperity gospel. It makes you wealthy, and it has done. It's made some of them very wealthy. But what about all the others who are sacrificially giving in the expectation that God will make them also materially wealthy? It doesn't seem to be happening. They're staying in their shanty towns and slum dwellings, whilst the pastor is going around in Cadillacs and wearing very smart suits and going on business trips around the world. So that's a bit of a caricature, but it's quite widespread. But that's known about. And my concern is the bit that's not known about in Pentecostalism, which is actually a different kind of prosperity gospel that talks about thrift, hard work, taking risk, enterprise, and growing companies. Prosperity in a much more holistic kind of way. That's not about pennies from heaven making you overnight wealthy in a miraculous way, but about the fullness of the prosperity. You could use the word wheel, which is an old-fashioned word from which we get the word wealth, which is more about well-being. And there is plenty within the evangelical Pentecostal charismatic movement that isn't prosperity gospel of the sort I first described, but is wanting to promote prosperity in the second way I've described in terms of well-being, but that's not disconnected to hard work, to getting as much education as you can, to taking risks, to being innovative and original, to come up with products and services that people actually want to part with money to buy, and that way to create jobs and livelihoods that raises individuals and communities out of poverty.
And would you say that religious leaders are entrepreneurs?
They can be, and in these churches, they often model the key characteristics of commercial entrepreneurs. They take risks. They deal with financial uncertainties. They need to balance the books. They need to grow communities. And when those communities become a certain size, they need to branch out and form new communities. Well, that's very entrepreneurial church leadership, but it's a similar set of skills that's needed in the commercial world to grow companies that can lift people out of poverty. So I do think there's a crossover between people growing up in churches that are very entrepreneurial and people growing up to be good entrepreneurs. So children, young people, teenagers, young adults, young professionals in these churches are picking up in their church environment from a very early age skills that are going to be very useful to them in the future for growing companies. It's not magic, and not everybody in those churches have those skills. We don't, in a way, need everybody to be an entrepreneur. That's often the problem in many developing countries. There's too many entrepreneurs. Almost everybody is an entrepreneur in one way or another because it's the only way of getting bread on the table for the next day. But what we need are a few very highly skilled entrepreneurs who will grow companies that will make jobs for the rest of us. Most people need a job. They don't need to be entrepreneurs, but who's going to produce the jobs if it's not the entrepreneurs? And, you know, the business sector employs more people than any other. People often think about education, health, government, and various other sectors when they think about creating jobs. But it's actually business all around the world in rich countries and poor countries that creates far more jobs than any other. And there are literally millions and millions of small to medium-sized companies. They are the backbone of every economy on earth. Rich countries, poor countries, it doesn't matter where they are in the scale. It's small to medium-sized enterprises that produce the most jobs around the world. So yes, religious leaders can be great entrepreneurs and set a wonderful role model for people in those religious communities to become great commercial entrepreneurs. And I think that is great news for development, because the evangelical Pentecostal charismatic movement is the only movement that is growing significantly around the world. It's the fastest growing Christian movement in the world and is responsible for the most growth of Christianity. Where the church is growing around the world is where the evangelical Pentecostal charismatic movement is growing in the main. And for that reason, I think that spells good news for development. And it's good news that we're already seeing being realized, that it is the fact that despite the great challenges to the global economy that we see all around us, and we seem to go from one crisis to another, it's still the case that there are more people coming out of poverty now than at any other time in the world. The level of wealth creation is greater than any other time in history, and the number of people being delivered out of abject poverty is happening on a rate we've never known before.
Back to the point about small businesses, gazelles, high growth opportunity driven firms, they create growth. Most people don't need to become entrepreneurs. I've interviewed a number of scholars in this area on the show.
Yeah, so what's your question,
Yeah,
Lipton?
no, I would know you are saying that small businesses are the engine of growth. And
Yeah,
I'm saying that your point on entrepreneurship is right. Most people don't need to become entrepreneurs, but
yeah,
it's really the opportunity driven entrepreneurs that create growth. Most small businesses don't scale.
that's right. Yes. And they don't scale in environments of low trust.
A brilliant point. I've been making this argument on the show for a long time. Trust is crucial for growth. When you trust people, you can collaborate and innovate more.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can trust then people that you're not related to. So in low income countries, the most trust is between family members, but that can be quite limited. So you know you're middle aged and you've got a teenage daughter or son, and you'll employ them in the business, and then they will do the same for their child, and so it goes on. That is a small circle of trust, meaning that that business will also stay small. But what high trust environments allow you to do is to trust strangers. And it's the ability to trust strangers that allows countries to grow companies of significant size to create the number of jobs they need to come out of poverty.
Yes, I've seen quite a few papers on the link between trust and innovation, and one of them looked at the Americas. In small countries, low trust is a big problem. It's also linked to corruption. And for venture capital and innovation to work, you have to trust people who don't live in your community or who are unknown to your relatives. And that's a big problem in developing countries, especially in some parts of the Caribbean, like Trinidad and Jamaica. I live
Yeah.
in Jamaica.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. So if you have very strong legal structures, you can trust people you don't know and don't live near you and you don't know anything about, because because all players in the deal need to subscribe to the same set of rules and be punished by them if they infringe them. But when there are exceptions made and people scratch each other's back because they've had their own back scratched, and people pass envelopes under the table, so to speak, that is when it is not possible to have the trust required to deal with strangers. And capitalism really demands you to deal with strangers, because capitalism is about grow. It's not just about kind of making enough for you and your family. That you don't get to capitalism. What happened with the Protestant Reformation was that the business sphere moved outside of the home into large scale enterprises, and that was only possible because of the rule of law and strong legal systems that would hold everybody to account. It's not to say that there wasn't exploitation, and it's not to say that there was no corruption, but it is to say that you allow law rather than favors to take the dominant role.
all, all right then. So back to the issue of the Protestant ethic, the evangelical movement, and capitalism. In your piece on page 6, you write, Peter Berger has offered a tentative view. He suggests that although the Protestant virtues are alive and well in early capitalism, they may become obsolete in mature capitalism because the creativity of the knowledge economy demands hedonism rather than ascet asceticism. Is he correct?
Yeah. Let me remind myself of what I was saying there. Yeah, I think this is always the charge that's leveled, that capitalism will allow you to become wealthy, but when you do, the dangers of wealth are such that it will start to implode. In a way, capitalism devours its own children. And I think that is worth thinking about. John Wesley often warned his followers, later called Methodists, not to allow their newfound life in Christ, which allowed them to save and be thrifty and to make money and acquire wealth, to mean that they started to lose the very values on which that wealth was created. So I think although Peter Berger is right to point out danger, I don't think it's inevitable. And there does seem to be plenty of evidence, even amongst like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, that the ones that do really well are those that do display hard work, discipline, the ability to delay gratification, and shun hedonistic lifestyles. It's a bit of a caricature that very wealthy entrepreneurs live hedonistic lifestyles and are narcissistic and only think about themselves. Generally, people like that don't last very long in business. I know many very wealthy, very successful entrepreneurs who have come from absolutely nothing, who more or less live the same kind of thrifty lifestyle now than they did when they were very unwealthy. And it's that lifestyle that has allowed them to become wealthy. So this is called by psychologists the ability to delay gratification. If you're going to grow a company, it's no good going out and spending your profits. You have to invest your profits to grow a company. That requires a mindset that is future orientated rather than is about consumption right now. And people who, it's child psychologists will tell you that children under the age of about 3, they don't understand about delayed gratification. If they're hungry, they'll cry and put up a fight and scream and get in a bad mood. But as a child kind of gets, towards 5 years old, they've learned that there's actually some wisdom in delaying gratification. They can actually wait for a meal. They can be told by their parents that they're not going to get their presents for their birthday today because it's not their birthday today, it's tomorrow. And they understand delayed gratification. And human beings that fail to learn the joys of delayed gratification become monstrous human beings.
Self-control is important.
Sorry?
Self-control is important. It's a predictor of success, especially economic success.
Yes.
And academic success.
Yes, and business leaders are associated with the opposite of that. They're considered to be hedonists, and it's not true. You cannot be a successful entrepreneur. And I'm talking about people who started life poor and became very wealthy. They have generally not been able to do that by being hedonists and narcissists and individualists and autonomous self-seeking people. They have generally only been to do it by being relationally very rich, very wealthy in their relationships, by being very hardworking, by, if necessary, working more than one job so they can start their business whilst they've got a stable income. Sometimes by mortgaging or remortgaging their own house and putting their whole family finances at risk. These are psychological skills that are actually quite rare. And in the main, and of course there's exceptions, entrepreneurs need this ability to be future-minded in order to be successful.
Entrepreneurs like to promote minimalism. It's no longer fashionable to project vulgar wealth. And secondly, your point on relationships is important. So when I'm speaking to business people or reading business articles, the word relationship is a recurring leitmotif. Relationships are important in business. You need to build a relationship with people to get them to trust you. So the opposite of that argument that entrepreneurs are hedonistic, as you said, is just untrue. There isn't much evidence for it, or even anecdote, and or even real anecdotes anymore. That's not what I'm seeing.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I work with very conscientious business leaders who feel actually that they're so misunderstood that they hardly dare to lift their heads, particularly in church circles, because it's thought that they're serving mammon and they need to be serving God. And if they're serving God, they wouldn't be making all this money. And it's a great shame. And they're sometimes treated well when they are wanted to fund a aspect of the church's work. But in the main, it's thought, well, that, you know, they can make money as long as it goes to good causes. Whereas actually, the ones I meet want to make money in a way that is a good cause in itself. In other words, that they do well by doing good, and the two aren't in conflict. It's not what they do with the profits that they're most excited about. It's how they make their profits that they're excited about, because they feel that that's their vocation. That's what they're good at. That's how they want to serve God. Writing checks to charities, you know, isn't what gets them out of bed every morning. It's the business itself. That's what they're passionate about. And if they can see the value of that to humanity and to the planet, that's reward in itself, let alone any checks they can write on top of that to making the world a better place. And many of them do that too.
Businesses do good by doing well. If you're not doing well, you can't do good. And for you to do good, you must create value. So obviously, entrepreneurs are going to care more about value than charity, because if they're not creating value, they can't invest in charities.
Correct.
This is a point I keep telling people. Businesses have to do well before they can do good, and value creation is better than charity. When innovators create new goods and services, these products will improve the quality of our living standards, therefore making us less dependent on charity.
That's right. That's right. Creating value should be the focus. If you create value, somebody's going to pay for it. You've created value. So people are going to say, the money in my pocket is of less value to me than what you're offering me. So creating value, that's absolutely spot on, Lipton. That's what a successful and ethical entrepreneur needs to do, and to serve the customer. So they've got a product of value, but they need to serve the customer in that customer accessing this product of value. And then the customer will want to part with their funds. They can't wait to buy what you're offering, because you've treated them well, and the item that you're offering for them is a value item, more valuable than whatever money it costs that they then have to do without. So it's about exchange. And this is a great Christian virtue, I think. And there is an exchange in the cross that Jesus takes on the sins of the world. He exchanges his life for us. So the concept of added value and making an exchange in order to guarantee that value ought not to be so distant from a Christian mindset or worldview than it is. Because this is what Jesus came in the world to give, he said, was life in all its abundance. He adds value. Jesus adds value. It's not the full gospel, but it's a very important part of the gospel, that human life is valuable in and of itself, but faith in Jesus Christ adds value to the human life that's God's gift to all of human beings. It makes us more the people that we were supposed to be. It will make us more joyful. It will make us more human than we would be without faith in Jesus Christ.
On the life of Jesus can teach us quite a bit about entrepreneurship. Jesus, for one, exhibited unlimited self-control. Jesus, for one, serves people without gratifying himself. So that's the anti-pride mentality. And
Yeah.
pride is not an attractive trait up to a point, because most successful people have some level of pride. Let's be realistic. I've read some of the studies on this topic. Pride serves a purpose, but up to a point. After a while, pride can manifest into people becoming exceptionally unlikable.
Yeah.
So pride serves a point. It can motivate people to be successful, but the life of Jesus as a case study in social entrepreneurship, maybe that's a topic you should research. Did you research it already? I don't know. But if you haven't, maybe you should.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he started work either as a carpenter, or biblical scholars now say that word for carpenter is probably actually a builder. So Jesus was probably a small entrepreneur doing small building works. A tekton is the Greek word, and so he wasn't necessarily polishing furniture and planing new tables. He may have done that too, but he was probably a small scale builder. Anyway, whatever he did as a profession, you're absolutely right. He had all the characteristics that would make a good business leader. And in that way, the Bible as a whole, the Old Testament too, is the best business book that any business leader could want to access. Of course, it has to be brought into the modern era, but the wisdom that it contains and the example that we have in Jesus Christ are unbelievably valuable to today's entrepreneurs. When we interview them, we ask them about their relationship with Scripture and whether they find it relevant to the work they do in the fast-paced global economy of the 21st century. And so many of them do. And interestingly, so many of them quote Proverbs as their favorite book, the book that they think is most relevant. Well, that book is full of practical wisdom, isn't it? It's you can just open it almost anywhere and you'll read practical wisdom. And when you get to the end of it, you'll see a model of what we could call a female entrepreneur.
But Professor Peter, recently I have been ruminating on this topic in the Bible. Due to a lack of knowledge, the people perish. That's really a powerful statement, because if you don't acquire useful knowledge and use it properly, you shall surely perish, especially in our knowledge-based economy. And I've been ruminating on quite a bit, because I live in a space where I think that people are literally perishing for a lack of knowledge. 33% of people are considered to be financially literate. If you're financially illiterate, you are going to make bad decisions. When you get money, instead of saving and investing it, you're going to expend it on conspicuous consumption, and that will compound the problem if you are poor. So I've been speaking about this topic for quite a bit. For a lack of knowledge, the people perish.
Good for you.
Yes, and this is also related to entrepreneurship, because if you're a brilliant person with entrepreneurial abilities, but you don't know to use it, you shall surely perish, Peter. And a lot of people are indeed perishing throughout the world because they lack knowledge.
Yes.
And it's a serious issue. You may not, you may just be saying yes and just be smiling on your face, but it's really a serious issue. A lot of people are in poverty because of a lack of knowledge.
Yeah. So what we need to do is to teach these biblical principles, don't we?
Yes, Peter. That's why I started this show. Well, I'm a Christian. On this show, I don't really speak much about my personal religious convictions, because viewers like it when you're objective, and I think that's good business. So if you're an entrepreneur in the realm of ideas like myself, you have to be objective and honest. So even if recently I read a quote from your piece, and that word, I struggle to pronounce that word because I have a minor speech impediment. And for the longest while, I was just so annoyed, because the quality of the words, your enunciation is important in this business. The word was asceticism. Yes, I have a list, but I struggle to pronounce it.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'm just really annoyed. You might not hear it in my voice, but even though I'm just really so annoyed.
Yeah. It's not often that business leaders are associated with asceticism. That's normally thought to be for monks and nuns and people who go and hide away in monasteries. But actually, it is a requirement. A worldly asceticism is at the heart of the Protestant work ethic. So you take, for instance, the way that Puritans dressed. It was very plain. You can see this in paintings of the era, that kind of staunch Calvinists wore kind of black, usually, and quite drab clothing. And if you look at, from the same period, pictures of wealthy people, they generally have wigs on, they have fluffy collars on, they've got kind of very colourful breeches on, and they've got dogs and horses and guns and all sorts of things around them. So the contrast couldn't be greater. So these Calvinists, they are wealthy, but you wouldn't know it from the way they look, because they're not spending their money on the way they look. They're spending their money by investing it back into the business. When I was in the United States a few years ago, I visited the Amish communities, and they literally wear this kind of clothing today, don't they? They're not spending any money on fancy dress. They're just dressing the way that their ancestors dressed. And some of them are building up quite profitable enterprises, particularly working with wood. So often working with their hands, it's labor intensive, but it's very lucrative because it's handmade. So it's kind of a gap in the market. And that reminded me of the Puritans of history, was that they were into sober living. And this is the kind of lifestyle that the early settlers of the United States had when they moved over to the New World. They couldn't rely on any privileges. They had themselves, their intellect, their hands, their feet, their bodies, and not much else to see them through. And many of them didn't see themselves through. They had terrible famine to start with. As you know the story, it's a well-known story. But they were ascetic, and they were hardworking, and they were disciplined, and they put their faith in God. And the United States, in large part, reflects that legacy. Not only that legacy, there were indigenous Americans as well, but in part it reflects that legacy, the ability to put enjoyment of worldly things into perspective.
All right, so we're wrapping up, and you are literally going to be really brief because we only have literally like 2 or so minutes left. But there's this passage in your article that's really exceptional, and I'm going to encourage our listeners to read it. It is on page 7. Christianity is the key to the success of the Western world. It's a statement from Chinese scholars, and one of the statements was actually in a book published by Neil Ferguson. Some Chinese academics seem to believe that the West is powerful because of Christianity.
That's right.
Yes. So you can just comment briefly before we wrap up.
Well, that's very interesting because some of these are Chinese experts who say, look, it's Christianity that has made the world wealthy, and the best thing Chinese people can do is to welcome Christianity rather than oppress Christianity. And it looked like China was opening up to Christianity in many ways. Churches were growing. There seemed to be a more benevolent attitude towards Christianity and church growth than there used to be under communism, and it was a remarkable change. And things are now starting to change, aren't they? The last couple of years, we're starting to see more and more restrictions on Christian activity, etc. So I think we have to see what's going to happen as an economic consequence of this lack of freedom. But there's no doubting it that there are some intellectuals around the world, but particularly in developing countries, that say, look, if you look at history and if you look at what's happening in the world today, you cannot deny the economic significance of Christian faith and Christian communities, and that this spells hope for the world. As the world becomes more religious, and it is becoming more religious, so it ought to be able also to enter into more of the well-being that is our potential inheritance. So I think
Yes.
it's a positive message.
And my last point is that religiosity eases the burden of low socioeconomic status. A new paper published by PINA. So yes, religion has several benefits, in particular Christianity. Christianity promotes savings, and this is an empirical issue that has been studied. But Peter, you were great, and it's a pleasure that you actually took the time out from your busy schedule to show up on the show.
Thank you so
All
much. It
right.
was great. It was a wonderful
And
conversation. Thanks
Acton
for giving me the
Institute. I
opportunity.
love Acton Institute.
Good.
All right,
Good.
Peter. Bye.
Yeah,
We'll talk again. We'll
blessings.
definitely talk again. But I
Thank you,
have to
Lipton.
run.
Blessings on your work. All the
All right.
best.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.